bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hi everyone,
Hey folks,
it's Erin from Seoul,
and it's Almer in Toronto.
and another week, another Das Criminal episode. Welcome back to your favorite political true crime podcast.
Yeah, you're probably going to be listening to this on Tuesday, so I hope you have a good week ahead of you.
We will have a bonus episode later out this week. We've just had to move some things around due to some personal commitments right now. Our Patreon subscribers, don't worry, you're always going to get those 3 pieces of bonus content every month. We've just had to make some adjustments.
Yeah, we've been very busy, but you will get your content.
Yes, we are working very hard behind the scenes. We have an extreme downer ahead. Sorry to start out your week with such a sad episode, but it is an important one. We do try to alternate sort of between more fun ones. Not that true crime is ever the most fun, but you get what we mean. More fun ones. Last week was fraud. Very fun.
There is a fun bit in this episode. There's a particular bit that's quite amusing.
Oh yeah, when you least see it coming.
Yeah.
Welcome back to East Asia. It is my new home for a while, so we're trying to do a little bit more stuff over here.
Yeah, it's not, I haven't seen it covered as extensively as other regions, so I hope we're exploring new territory.
On August 6th and August 9th of 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Combined, these bombs killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people. The 2 bombs, freakishly named Little Boy and Fat Man, were the first and only nuclear weapons used in armed conflict, though the global nuclear arsenal has increased to an alarming size. Imperial Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, 6 days after the second nuclear attack, ending the Second World War in the Pacific Ocean theater. Growing up in the United States, we learned in history classes that the atomic bombs were a sad but necessary means to cease a brutal war. We were taught that Japan would not surrender, and that the slow drive toward an Allied victory would claim many more lives than the bombs. And while some historians agree with this interpretation of events, others dispute that the bombs were necessary to Japan's surrender. Furthermore, ethicists and philosophers have argued that the use of nuclear weapons, particularly in areas with high civilian populations, constitutes a war crime or some form of state terrorism. In this episode, we're going to discuss the atomic bombings of Japan, the precipitating events, the explosions themselves, and the controversy that has surrounded this use of nuclear weapons ever since. So let's start by looking at the Pacific Ocean theater. There's kind of a problem with World War II episodes in that there's more literature than we could ever review in our lifetimes. See our episode on Adolf Eichmann. It's one of our more extended pieces, and we mention a dozen different things that we'd like to explore in greater detail. I'm sure there are plenty of World War II history buffs out there who would tell us we're leaving out important details, and we are always open to constructive feedback. But we aren't claiming that this is the definitive take on atomic bombs. Of course, we're not saying that. Without getting too deep into the weeds of historiographical subjectivity, World War II is a conflict in which the Axis powers, the Nazis and their allies, are rightfully seen as the baddies. Again, see that Mitchell and Webb sketch. But that doesn't mean that everyone else involved was an angel who could do no wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to separate hindsight from feelings at the time of them happening, insofar as up until the Nazi invasion of Poland, for example, in September 1939, the Allies, the Western Allies, particularly France and the UK, were content leaving Germany to do as it will in Central Europe, having been devastated by World War I and not particularly in the mood for another war. Of course, this culminated with Neville Chamberlain's concessions, giving Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, and then coming home to the UK to claim that he had achieved peace in our time. which is an ironic claim, really.
Furthermore, Japan had already begun imperial expansion in East Asia and the Pacific before it signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September of 1940. In 1910, for instance, Japan annexes Korea and controls the country until the end of World War II in 1945. While Korea's present relationship with Japan is complicated, the 1910 to 1945 occupation left deep scars on Korean society. Japan was brutal to Korea, forcing women into sexual slavery and attempting to wipe out the Korean language and culture, and that legacy is understandably detested here in Korea.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Japan still denies the existence of comfort women.
Yes and no. I don't think they're in complete denial. And by the way, I try to avoid the word comfort women. They're sex slaves. Like, let's not put euphemisms on it. They're sex slaves. Yeah. You'll hear comfort women pretty much only in this context about Japan abusing women in East Asia, right? But so I work with kids and they will say things which are kind of startling to me, like, they hate Japan, they hate Japanese, and then others will jump in and say, oh, I don't hate Japanese people, I just don't like what they did to Korea. They're kind of still forming those political ideas, but it's enough to say that it's there. It's present in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can imagine. Like, it's not difficult when, up until very recently, this was all part of living memory.
Yeah, and recently, for the purpose of class, I had a picture of Shinzo Abe on the screen, and one of my students said, take that down, I can't look at his face, I hate him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's intense.
Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a thing. So in 1937, Japan invades China and commits horrific crimes there, including the rape of Nanjing. They commit many mass killings, particularly in China and the Philippines, and tortured prisoners of war and carried out medical experiments on living captives. Without comparing suffering or atrocities, I think it's reasonable to say that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan weren't only allies out of convenience. They shared an underlying fascist ideology and committed acts of genocide in search of a racially pure ethno-state.
Yeah, on the topic of carrying out medical experiments, I wonder if we should do an episode separate on Unit 731, which is a whole other topic altogether.
Yeah.
Horrifying, by the way, but yeah. And we also mentioned in our episode on the Indonesian genocide, but initially the Japanese were welcomed in some areas, including, Dutch Indochina, as liberators from, the previous colonial powers, be they the British, French, or Dutch. And however, unfortunately, those assumptions were quickly dashed because Japan imposed its own ethno-nationalism and racial superiority on the conquered peoples.
Japan's involvement in World War II is typically framed in Western discourse as its alliance with Germany and Italy and the war with the United States in the Pacific. But for Japan's neighbors, the suffering began for years before the war. On December 7, 1941, Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii in a surprise military strike against the United States. This was intended to destroy crucial American fleets to prevent them from interfering with Japanese conquests in the Pacific, such as the invasion of the Philippines about 10 hours later.
Yeah, on that point, while the official hot war with Japan began with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US was treating Japan with hostility for years before. I mean, following Japan's invasion of China, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued an oil embargo on Japan, which has devastating effects given Japan's, at that point, been importing all its oil from the US, and oil at this point was necessary for its war machine. And it was this oil embargo itself that pressured Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor preemptively to disable or cripple the US military and pave the way for Japan to annex Dutch Indochina and the Philippines and the oil fields in the sea there. And so Japan may argue, and whether that's accurate or not depends on where you stand, that the US sanctions were the real start of the war. Though again, that itself came as a response to Japanese atrocities in China.
It's also worth noting that Hawaii was a US territory at that point and didn't become a state until 1959. This isn't very relevant to the attack, as an attack on a territory is still an attack, But it's worth pointing out that Hawaii, like all of the United States, is presently occupied land. And Hawaii in particular had a constitution. It was a constitutional monarchy when the United States stole it from its people. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt described the attack as, quote, a date which will live in infamy, end quote. And I just want to kind of problematize all of this and say, how come it's so abominable when Japan does this to the United States, but when Israel did the same thing to Egypt in 1967, it's a preemptive strike and military strategy? Which is it?
Yeah, there's a lot of double standards in war history, unfortunately.
So the United States is drawn into World War II, and the battlefront with Japan is known as the Pacific Theater or the Pacific Ocean Theater. Japanese internment camps were formed in the United States where people of Japanese heritage are rounded up and incarcerated for merely being Japanese.
Yeah, and Canada did the same thing with both its Japanese and German populations.
From the outset, the United States is very bitter about this attack. And I'm not saying this isn't partially justified, as bombing Pearl Harbor without a declaration of war was considered unfair under the rules of war, but just pointing out that there was already bad blood and a desire for revenge among some Americans. The Pacific Ocean Theater was particularly brutal. Japanese soldiers were notorious for fighting until their last breath. Though the Allied forces were slowly winning, these gains came at huge costs. It wasn't uncommon for 95 to 99% of Japanese soldiers to die in battles that the United States ultimately won. They refused to surrender and would often kill themselves before being captured.
Yeah, this is a very important point. I mean, in some instances, Japanese soldiers would feign surrender only to pull a pin on a hidden grenade to take out the US soldiers that would try to come in close and capture them. And in that way, and I'm not saying this is good or not, but I do sympathize with US soldiers and a building distrust of Japanese soldiers in the front.
As Japan slowly lost territory in the Pacific, conditions on the home island steadily worsened. There was a lack of food and raw materials, and the civilian economy declined to the point of disaster. Defeat appeared inevitable. It was only a question of how long Imperial Japan could hang on. So the United States began making plans to invade Japan in a scheme known as Operation Downfall, which never came to fruition. They also devised plans for biological and chemical warfare.
Speaking of plans, one plan involved bat bombs. You heard that right. Not bath bombs, but bat, as in the animal bombs. To clarify, the US military spent $2 million between 1944 and 1945 experimenting with Mexican free-tailed bats, where the plan was to put bats in this hollow bomb-shaped casings with timed incendiary devices attached to the bats. These casings would be dropped by plane on Japan, and the casings would have parachutes attached to them. So they'd be dropped and the parachutes would deploy. And then while in midair, those casings would be opened by timer to release those bats from the casings. The bats would then be, presumably, they would fly to roost in eaves and other corners of Japanese cities, because that's what bats do. They try to find nice, comfortable corners to roost in. And the idea that they fly in, they'll roost for a bit, and then these incendiary devices that are attached to them would be timed to ignite. And once they ignite, they'd set Japanese cities on fire, because at that point, Japanese cities were mainly built of wood and paper. So it was an interesting plan, to say the least. But unfortunately, that plan never reached fruition. And I say unfortunately because it sounds hilarious. And unfortunately, the focus shifted to the Manhattan Project instead.
Wow, what could have been.
Yeah, we could have had an entire episode on the bat bombing of Japan.
Bats are extremely difficult to get rid of, too. If you have an infestation of bats, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, they could be classified as pests.
So the estimated human costs of the plans to invade Japan's home islands were really high, though exact numbers varied. Preceding conventional and firebombing attacked 67 Japanese cities, so it's not like the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the first. Meanwhile, scientists in the United States clandestinely carried out an assignment known as the Manhattan Project, the program to design and construct the world's first nuclear weapons. They ended up producing 2 different nuclear weapons: Little Boy, an enriched uranium gun-type fission weapon, and Fat Man, a plutonium implosion-type nuclear weapon. I hate all of this, but especially Little Boy. It makes my skin crawl.
Yeah, awful names.
On July 16th, 1945, they carry out the Trinity test in New Mexico, which demonstrates that the bomb is successful. Though the United States had dropped leaflets over Japanese cities and towns in the past warning of upcoming bombing events, they deliberately did not drop leaflets over Hiroshima warning specifically of the atomic bomb. This was partially because they wanted to avoid spoiling the surprise, which, what the fuck, and also because they chose cities that were not conventionally bombed to try and gauge the impact of the atomic bombs.
On that note, just want to clarify here, how do atomic bombs work? Now, I studied chemistry in university, so I have a cursory knowledge, but this is all, what we're going to go through here is basic. It's a lot more complicated in real life, but I'm going to try and, condense it for this episode. So an atom consists of a number of protons and neutrons in a nucleus surrounded by a cloud of electrons. And each element requires a particular ratio of protons and neutrons to be stable. And some elements have much larger numbers of protons and neutrons than others, and that makes them inherently less stable. And over time, those nuclei release neutrons and decompose, and that's what we call radioactivity. Now, the theory goes, if you hit a nucleus with a particle, then you can dislodge some amount of neutrons, which causes the nucleus of a particular atom to be so extremely unstable that it would split into fragments immediately. And this split, this sort of collapse into fragments, releases binding energy and heat. And we call that process fission. Now, Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jewish physicist who had fled Europe to the US in 1938, posited that if you had a large enough number of atoms in a compressed enough space, in a small amount of space, if you hit one atom, that would release neutrons. That would then hit another atom, that would release more neutrons, that would hit another atom, and it's exponential growth. So if you hit one atom, it releases 2 neutrons, and then 4, and then 8, and so on and so forth. And that would cause a chain reaction of fragmenting nuclei, each releasing neutrons that fragment more nuclei, which would release a massive amount of energy and heat. And that amount of atoms would be called a critical mass. Now, in nuclear power plants, you have control rods made of things like boron that are used to control the radioactive fuel. So they're lowered and raised into the fuel to absorb neutrons and ensure that the fuel remains near critical mass, enough to release enough heat to vaporize water into steam and thus move a turbine generating electricity without causing, a meltdown or an explosion. But if you wanted to make a bomb, what you do is you get fissile material, in this case uranium or plutonium, mostly uranium. You put it in a casing, a hollow casing, similar to the one used by bats, but not exactly the same. And you surround the casing with traditional, non-nuclear bombs. And those traditional bombs have a timer attached to them. The casing is then dropped by air, though nowadays you even have missiles, but at that point you were dropping it by air. And the traditional bombs would go off. And once the traditional bombs go off, the explosions they cause would force the fissile material into such a small amount of space, like compressing it, that it would set off a chain reaction, as I described earlier, where one neutron hits one atom, releasing another neutron, and they both decompose into fragments, releasing energy and heat, and so on and so forth, and it creates a chain reaction that leads to a nuclear explosion.
We know from history, obviously, that these effects are absolutely devastating, can destroy one city in a second.
Yeah, both immediate and long-term effects in terms of radioactivity.
We're going to get into the effects on Hiroshima and Nagasaki particularly. On July 26, 1945, the United States issues the Potsdam Declaration, So this is a warning that without surrender, the Allies would attack Japan in such a way that would guarantee, quote, the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces and just as inevitably the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland, end quote. Japan didn't respond to the ultimatum, likely indicating it was totally unaware that the United States had succeeded in constructing an atomic bomb. We're going to get into the possible reasons Japan didn't surrender later in the episode, so just put a pin in this. We'll get back to it later. On August 6th, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. Japanese time, the aircraft Enola Gay drops Little Boy on the center of Hiroshima.
And here, there's a little ironic story that I want to get into. Before the bomb was dropped, it was transported to the airbase by a ship called the USS Indianapolis. It was a US Navy cruiser that delivered the bomb to this airbase in Tinian Island in the Pacific. On its way to the Philippines, after delivering the bomb, it was going to the Philippines for training exercises. It was sunk on July 30th, 1945 by Japanese submarines. Of the 1,195 crewmen, 890 survived the initial explosion and sinking. But because the mission was top secret, no SOS signal was sent. The Navy only accidentally learned of the sinking 4 days later when a Lockheed Ventura airplane spotted the survivors in open water while on regular patrol. In a dark twist of fate, of the 890 that went into the water, only 316 survived. The rest of the crewmen died due to exposure, dehydration, hypothermia, shark attacks, and saltwater poisoning.
Damn, that is really sad.
Yeah, it's mentioned in the movie Jaws.
So, when this bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people were just immediately incinerated, like immediately killed in the bomb blast. Hiroshima was a supply and logistics base of the Japanese army, but there were also lots of civilians living there, many of whom perished in the bomb attack. I'm going to read for you part of a survivor named Kikushioda, her testimony, and please be aware it is graphic content, so maybe skip forward a minute if these kinds of descriptions really bother you. Quote, burned bodies were scattered everywhere, making it impossible to walk without stepping on someone. The sisters saw a newborn baby still attached to its dead mother's umbilical cord, lying on the side of the road. As the pair walked the streets of Hiroshima, their 10-year-old brother conducted a similar search. When Chiyoda finally spotted him standing among a crowd of people, she was horrified. All the skin on his face was peeling off and dangling, she said. He was limping feebly, all the skin from his legs burned and dragging behind him like a heap of rags. The young boy survived his injuries. His 14-year-old sister, Mitsu, did not. Though the family never recovered her body, they were forced to face the worst after finding a scrap of Mitsu's school uniform burnt into asphalt. I thought my heart would surely stop because the very cloth I found was my sister's, Mitsu, my little sister, Chiyoda remembered. Mi-chan, I called out to her. It must have been terribly hot. The pain must have been unbearable. You must have screamed for help. My tears falling, I searched for my sister in vain. 1 month after the bombing, the family lost another loved one. Chiyoda's mother, who had appeared to be in good health up until the day before her passing, died of acute leukemia caused by the blast's radioactive rays. She was cremated in a pit dug by a neighbor as her grief-stricken daughter looked on. End quote. Japan still did not surrender. At this point, the whole world knew that the United States had used a nuclear weapon and might use another. Again, why Japan did not surrender at this point is still a topic of debate, which we will discuss further on in the episode during our section on the controversies. On August 9th, 1945, at 12:02 a.m., the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and sends more than 1 million soldiers into Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeastern China. The Soviet Union and Japan had previously had a non-aggression pact, and the Japanese had assumed that the Soviets were busy fighting the Nazis on their western front. But by this time, the Nazis in Germany had already surrendered, and the atomic bomb offered the Soviets a great opportunity for a surprise attack. Note, however, they did declare war on Japan an hour before invading, as per the rules and regulations. On August 9th, 1945, at 11:02 a.m. Japanese time, aircraft Boxcar drops Fat Man on Nagasaki. The estimates for immediate deaths ranged from 22,000 to 75,000 people. The United States originally intended to drop Fat Man on Kokura on August 11th, but due to weather conditions, moved the bombing date to August 9th and attacked their second target, Nagasaki.
I do want to jump in here and point out that based on what I've read, the US at that point only had Little Boy and Fat Man nuclear bombs. And after dropping on Nagasaki, the US basically bluffed to Japan that they had more and they were willing to drop more to force a surrender. But in reality, they didn't, and it would have taken them several months to make another nuclear bomb. So at that point, they had depleted all their nuclear stockpiles.
That is true, and I also wonder, they intended to drop Fat Man on Kokura on August 11th, and they say it's due to weather conditions that they moved the time and date. Could it also partially be because of the Soviet invasion? Because the United States did not want Japan to surrender and look like that was because of the Soviet invasion rather than the bombs?
Oh, I absolutely think that's the case. I also think the US was worried that Japan will end up in a situation similar to Europe, where the Soviet Union carves itself a sphere of influence, whether through direct annexation or through like satellite states. And the US was willing to drop another nuclear bomb to make sure the Soviet Union doesn't take a foothold in Japan.
On August 15th, 1945, 6 days after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, Japan surrenders. Documents are officially signed on September 2nd, and Japan ceased all military actions and only very recently started recruiting for its own military again. This also liberated prisoners of war. There were a lot more long-lasting effects from the bombs, however. The total number of people killed stands somewhere between 129,000 and 226,000, depending on how one measures death from the bombs. Of course, you had injuries resulting from the blasts, missing limbs, paralysis, etc. But really, you saw an increase of cancer due to radiation, especially leukemia, and birth defects for generations as a result of radiation poisoning.
Yeah, radiation is not a pleasant experience. It's probably one of the most horrific ways to die or to be born with radiation poisoning.
Now we're going to get into the controversy around the nuclear weapons. So, of course, the United States' use of nuclear weapons against Japan is one of the most controversial episodes of military force in recent history. The debate centers on two main issues with their own sub-disputes. First, was the bombing necessary? In other words, did the bombs force Japan to surrender, and would Japan have surrendered if the bombs had not been used? To go off this, to what degree were the bombs a factor in Japan's surrender versus other events, like the Soviet invasion of Manchuria? And moreover, were the human casualties brought on by the bombs fewer than those which would have transpired in a conventional invasion? The second dispute is whether the bombing was moral. Is the use of nuclear weapons, especially against an area with a high civilian population, ever moral? Don't nuclear weapons make it impossible to avoid civilian casualties? And has the United States' use of nuclear force in war set a dangerous precedent for the rest of the world? This is further complicated by the use of two bombs. Some people might believe that the first was necessary, but the second went too far. Let's first explore those positions which support the use of the atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or at least Hiroshima. The main reason I've heard and read cited in support for the atomic bombs is that it might have prevented as many as hundreds of thousands to 1 million US military casualties. There is a danger, of course, in arguing what-ifs. War strategists have been wrong many times. For an interesting look at this, see our Julius Caesar episode and how he was able to overcome the odds in all of these different battles. Obviously, a land invasion would have cost lives. I don't think anyone could argue against that. But how many lives on both sides of the conflict could be debated forever? And we'll never really know since this isn't the outcome that occurred. Also note the use of US military casualties. Japanese casualties were also expected to be extremely high in the event of a land invasion. Actually, Japanese casualties were high throughout the war, as Japanese soldiers would not surrender in circumstances where other armies would. In other words, they had to be completely militarily defeated rather than pushed back.
Yeah, also at this point, Japanese military command had been running out of trained soldiers. So for the defense of the home islands, they were recruiting women and children as well as the elderly. And these recruits were women, children, elderly, civilians basically, were given weapons and cursory training to defend the beaches with the instructions of defending the home island to the last child. So in effect, the whole civilian population was mobilized to fight.
And to give you an example of how steadfast Japan was, from Wikipedia, quote, of the 22,060 Japanese combatants entrenched on Iwo Jima, 21,844 died either from fighting or by ritual suicide, end quote. So they would not surrender. They would fight and fight and fight. The atomic bombs brought about significant Japanese civilian casualties. So we have to decide, morally, how many, if any, civilian casualties amount to a military casualty. And in that same vein, how many Japanese casualties amount to one American casualty? Why does this discourse center so much on Allied casualties? Now, that being said, I think one Soviet casualty is actually worse than 1,000 Nazi casualties, just in my opinion.
I completely agree, but I find it hilarious that the Black Book of Communism, which is, fake, but anyways, it counts Nazi deaths in the war as victims of communism, which I agree they're victims of communism, but in a good way, and that I support communism defeating the Nazis. On your point on civilian casualties, I think the problem with World War II is that it was the perfect embodiment of total war. So the line between civilian and military is so blurred. Like, would you consider a civilian working in a factory making tanks or guns a valid target? If they're bombing a factory and a civilian is there, is that a valid target? Or a civilian doing other sort of logistical or support work?
Well, and also, just like I live in an apartment block in Korea, I live on the 7th floor. What if someone really, really bad lived on the 3rd floor and they were hoarding weapons and all this stuff, and my whole apartment block was bombed to get that person? The story would be terrorist killed in Korea, not Erin is killed because she lives in the same building.
I'll definitely make a story about how you were killed too. I definitely write an article on
Thanks,
that.
Amr. So there is also the argument that the atomic bombs on Japan saved lives in Asia. So the Japanese surrender, of course, ended the Japanese occupation of China, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. Continuation of said occupation would have arguably killed more Chinese civilians. It also limited Japanese expansion in Vietnam and the Dutch East Indies, which are now known as Indonesia, possibly curbing the effects of Japanese manufactured famine. Again, see our episode 28, The Jakarta Method, to learn more about the complicated relationship between Indonesia, Japan, and Western occupiers. From Wikipedia, quote, the Operation Meeting House firebombing raid on Tokyo alone killed 100,000 civilians on the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, causing more civilian death and destruction than either of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, end quote. Now, personally, I'd rather be immediately incinerated by an atomic bomb than die in a citywide fire knowing what was happening. Death is death, but I'd rather have a quick and unaware death than a slower and more painful one.
Oh, I completely second that. And on that note, I'd also specifically rather be in the center of a nuclear explosion, like in Bullseye, rather than on the outskirts or in the margins and dying slowly of radiation poisoning, which, like I said, is probably the most horrifying way to die, or at least up there. It's not good.
Well, we run a true crime murder podcast, so I've thought about it to some degree, and I would definitely rather be like shot in the head than strangled if I were to be killed by an individual. Like, I just want it to be fast. I want to die.
Oh yeah, same, same. But yeah, I'd rather also like be vaporized by an explosion than with radiation poisoning. What basically happens is that the radioactive atoms go through your body and basically destroy all your cells. Your blood vessels open up, your stomach lining melts. It's awful. It's horrifying.
Yeah, that's why the leukemia rates are so high.
Yeah.
Also, there's a Twitter account out there. I think it's Fallujah Birth or Fallujah Birth Defects, documenting all the birth defects in Fallujah in Iraq because of radiation poisoning from the bombs that the United States dropped in 2003.
Yeah, they use depleted uranium.
It's really, really horrific. So, supporters of the bombs have also argued that there were very few civilians in Japan and that the government had mobilized people like women, children, and the elderly to work in factories manufacturing war equipment. Of course, Amr has already mentioned this, but unlike the United States and Nazi Germany, where these factories were typically large, compact buildings, like a single munitions factory in an industrial area, Japanese manufacturing was spread out in small-scale operations around the country. In 1959, one of the Japanese pilots who led the attack at Pearl Harbor told one of the U.S. Air Force personnel who had engineered the atomic bombings, quote, "You did the right thing. You know the Japanese attitude at that time, how fanatic they were. They'd die for the emperor. Every man, woman, and child would have resisted that invasion with sticks and stones if necessary. Can you imagine what a slaughter it would be to invade Japan? It would have been terrible. The Japanese people know more about that than the American public will ever know." End quote. You've also probably heard about something called Bushido, which is the Japanese samurai code, and it means never surrender, never be captured, never break down, never let yourself be held by the enemy. Now, this could have played into Japan's leaders' refusal to surrender, but I'd also like to point out how they had already seen an example of unconditional surrender in Nazi Germany, and the Nazi officers were apprehended and charged with war crimes. So, if you are someone high up in the Japanese military, you may fear that an unconditional surrender would see you hanged for the crimes committed in Korea, China, the Philippines, and you might be more motivated to keep fighting, at least until you can find a way to get away, than to unconditionally surrender to save civilians that you don't really care about.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound too Orientalist here, but it's also important to note that in Imperial Japan, the emperor was seen as a literal living god, as the son of the sun, and a deity in and of himself as such. And if the emperor commanded the people to fight, they'd fight to the last child. So in that sense, it would have been a brutal block by block, street by street, house by house fight in which God knows how many people would have died.
Yeah, I don't like the way the US educational system just kind of lumps everyone in Japan into one block in this faceless enemy and says they were really evil, they wouldn't surrender, it's really sad, but we had to do it. I think that is an Orientalist framing, but I do not think it's wrong to say that in Imperial Japan, there was a cultural code of not surrendering.
Yes, yeah.
Now let's jump into opposition to the atomic bombs. So many argue that the atomic bombs were militarily unnecessary. In other words, they believe Japan would have surrendered without the use of the bombs. It doesn't seem like many people dispute that Japan would have eventually surrendered or lost the war. The question seems to be whether the use of the bombs was worth it in terms of a large amount of casualties at one time by a catastrophic event versus a slower conventional war. Some historians believe Japan's surrender would have been possible without a full-scale invasion. For instance, a submarine blockade might have forced surrender. This, however, probably would have caused many Japanese people to starve. Again, is starvation or dying from disease due to a lack of medicine a more humane death than being instantly incinerated by an atomic bomb?
Yeah, and similarly, is a large number of people dying in one concentrated city due to one explosion better or worse than the same number of people dying, but in a diffuse area due to famine or to conventional explosions or fire or so on? And I do also want to point out that at that point, before the nuclear bombs, Japan had been making very tentative hints of proposing a surrender, using the Soviet Union as a middleman. But the only thing that the US was demanding was unconditional surrender. And that was the one thing Japan was not willing to do. Any surrender Japan was considering at that point was very conditional, and they were trying to get a surrender that possibly included protection or immunity for high ranking military personnel, as well as retaining some colonial influence on at least Manchuria and Korea.
This is also just something we could debate forever. Like, what ifs can be a really endless cycle. What if they had done a submarine blockade? What if they had done conventional bombing? What if they had done this? Interesting questions to ask and definitely should be included in this debate, but it's so subjective. We're never going to know what would have happened. We do know they dropped the bombs and this is what happened, and this is what we have to think about.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Many scientists who developed the bomb opposed its use during war. Early critics included Albert Einstein, Eugene Wigner, and Leo Szilard. I keep wanting to say his name. Have you heard that song, Like a G6? And at one point they say, getting slizzard.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to pronounce poor Leo's name as Slizzard, but it's Szilard.
Like a G6 is a good song, though. To be fair, it does slap.
It bops, yeah. I'm really sorry to Professor Szilard.
Speaking of professors, one of the architects of the bomb, the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, had supported the bombing of Hiroshima, but he thought Nagasaki was militarily unnecessary, and he wrote of his revulsion. And after a meeting with President Truman went sour, the latter, i.e. President Truman, said that he did not want to see that son of a bitch again, referring to Oppenheimer.
Yeesh. So, Noam Chomsky has called the atomic bombs, quote, among the most unspeakable crimes in history, end quote. It's very difficult to consider civilian casualties in a massive bomb such as the atomic bomb or the Moab that was recently dropped on Afghanistan. Like, you cannot say you take civilian casualties into account and then drop an atomic bomb. It's just not possible.
Oh, yeah. It's like treating a pimple with an amputation, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And again, what if someone really bad happened to live near you, like in your apartment block or on your street or something, and they took that person out with a huge bomb that killed your entire family? I know it sounds extreme, but it's not. This is precisely what happens in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Japan. Howard Zinn referred to the bombings as state terrorism, and he elaborates, quote, World War II still remains the good war in the American mind. Yet there are troubling memories. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the revelation that we had caused perhaps 100,000 casualties in the bombing of Dresden, and the fact that we'd engaged in ruthless bombing of civilians. It was the good war, but it ended without the elimination of racism, tyranny, or aggression in the world. End quote. Some good points there, I think. I think it's pretty undisputed that the Axis powers were the baddies and that the United States very much sees itself as a good guy. And it's interesting, too, if you look at surveys from like France, in 1945, most of the French credited the Soviet Union, and rightfully so, with doing most of the work in defeating the Nazis. But now those numbers have switched. Now they think it's the Americans, the Brits, the French.
Oh yeah, it's all revisionism. It's all hindsight, but like not good hindsight. It's all like revisionism. The Red Army did by far the most to defeat the Nazis, and if it wasn't for Stalingrad, then God knows what would have happened, because the US arrived in late to basically hog the limelight. I also think it's interesting that we can acknowledge that the Nazis in Japan were bad guys and, understandable. But it's hilarious how the US would take the moral high ground at a time when the military was still segregated by race.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of Zinn's point that, okay, you defeated quote unquote fascism in Europe and in East Asia, but there is still this huge undercurrent of fascism, or at least, as he says, racism, tyranny, and aggression in the United States.
Yeah, I remember I read something about Jesse Owens, the field and track athlete, who won medals in the 1936 Olympic Games in Munich. And he talks about how in Nazi Germany, even though Germany had the sort of Aryan supremacy and, Ubermensch ideology, he was still treated with, modicum of respect and treated as befit a celebrity. And when he came back to the US at the same time, he was not invited to the White House to shake hands with the president. He had to use segregated diner tables and segregated water fountains and so on and so forth.
The Nazis used to drop leaflets on platoons of Black soldiers, asking them why they would fight in a segregated army. And of course, it's disgustingly ironic as the Nazis were rounding up Black people, Jewish people, disabled people, etc., and murdering them in death camps. But it is still a disparity that we should problematize.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There's another question here, which is, why didn't the United States just demonstrate the power of the atomic bomb and threaten Japan before actually dropping a bomb on a major Japanese city? Why didn't they drop it on some remote island in the Pacific to show Japan, look what we've got, surrender, or we're going to do this to you? The Trinity test in New Mexico was done in secret, so not even Americans near the blast site were aware of nuclear weapons testing. This resulted in countless health problems from nuclear radiation in the southwest United States.
Yeah, as we see in the historical and health documentary, The Hills Have Eyes.
It's also worth noting that many of those affected were indigenous peoples. New Mexico is a place where there are lots of indigenous peoples, and unsurprisingly, instead of dropping the bomb on, Scranton, Pennsylvania, they dropped it somewhere where mostly poor and indigenous peoples would be affected by it. US officials also feared that a failed bomb demonstration would have detrimental effects on the war, but wouldn't dropping a dud on Hiroshima city center have the same effect? Maybe a dud would have just blended in with all the other dud bombs, but I still don't see why they couldn't have said they have an atomic bomb and threatened to use it or demonstrated it.
Yeah, I mean, they should have at least tried, and if that failed, then they could be more justified in actually using it. But yeah, I struggle to see how not trying is somehow good from the US standpoint.
Yeah, and I just think saying, well, what if we tried to demonstrate it and it didn't work is like, okay, what if it didn't work when you dropped it on a city full of people?
Yeah.
I suppose it would be mildly embarrassing if they were like, oh, we have something to show you, and then it didn't work. Like when you try to show your friends some cool thing and it doesn't work the second you try to do it. But this is very different from that.
Yeah, also, to be fair, though, how would you demonstrate it? Because, this wasn't the time of live streaming and I guess sending a video, but even then, they could argue it's propaganda or something.
Yeah, I guess so. I think that is the point I really get hung up on, though, is deliberately making it a complete surprise, like not dropping leaflets that say, we're going to drop an atomic bomb on you, go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Of course, the bombings were a show of force to more countries than Japan. The Cold War began immediately following the surrender of the Axis powers, and the United States and the Soviet Union now had pretty much no reason to cooperate. The atomic bomb was an introduction to the nuclear arms race and a message to countries around the world not to fuck with the United States.
But specifically the Soviet Union.
Right, exactly. So we have to see the bombs in that context as well. It's not merely two bombs on Japan. It is a message to the entire world.
Yeah.
So how do we feel about it?
Mixed feelings. I understand why they were used, given the context at the time, but it's hard for me to justify it without at least attempts from the US to demonstrate the power of the bomb before using it on civilian population. I'm also a lot more cynical when it comes to like the line between civilian and military targets. I understand what you're saying about if you live in a house or you live in an apartment block with, a known mass murderer and someone just airstrikes the entire block. Yeah, I mean, with war, it's a very messy situation, it's not as easy as sending in a team of assassins to kill the emperor or whatever. I think that the atomic bomb was definitely overwhelming and not entirely necessary, but I struggle to think what would have been a good way to end the war.
I'm mostly in agreement with you. And I also think hindsight is a gift that we now have, and we can see the atomic bombings did not lead to world peace. In fact, they have led to nuclear proliferation around the world, which many people would agree is a dangerous thing. So we also have to consider how, yes, this ended the war in the Pacific theater, but aside from that, it didn't bring about global peace and prosperity.
Yeah, it just encouraged a new war between the Soviet Union and the US.
And also gave the Soviet Union very, very good reason to be frightened by the United States. And I don't blame them for building their own nuclear arsenal whatsoever, but it's just a very sad point that this is what the world has become.
Oh, absolutely. The same way I don't blame North Korea today or Iran in their nuclear ambitions, insofar as we saw what happened once Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program.
And Saddam.
Oh, yeah, and Saddam too.
Right. And those who have nuclear weapons or have a good friend willing to use them, such as Fidel Castro in Cuba having Soviet nuclear weapons, were able to fend off United States imperialism. It's something worth noting.
Oh, yeah.
So, again, to our Patreon subscribers, we should have a bonus episode for you this week. We just have some personal stuff we're working through right now. If you are not a Patreon subscriber, maybe check us out.
Yeah, please do.
You can follow us on Instagram at Das Criminal Pod. We post photos, maps, things like that relevant to the cases. We do not post graphic content, so do not worry that you will follow us and suddenly see a child with nuclear radiation poisoning. We don't do stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Please subscribe, rate, and tell your friends about our podcast. The more listeners we can get, the more they can get. We'll have our whole pyramid scheme going on, and it'll work out.
Yeah, it's kind of like a chain reaction, a nuclear chain reaction.
Oh, no. But thank you guys again for listening week after week. We love watching the podcast grow. It's so exciting for us. I can't believe this is week 36. Wow.
Yeah, time really flies.
We'll see you guys this week for our Patreon subscribers, next Tuesday for everyone else.
Yeah, till next time. Bye.
Bye.